բոլորին, իմ անունս Alfred Baghouzian է, ես աշխատում եմ Cybersecurity մեջ, ավելի ճիշտ Telecommunication Cybersecurity։ Իմ ներկայացումս անգլերենով այլու շատ կներեք, որովհետև բառամատ հերքե դժվարակալի, բայց կփորձեմ երբ որ հարցումները հարցնեք, պատասխանը հայերենով տամ լավ։ So I've had 30 years in telecommunication, and in telecommunication, cybersecurity was part of the design. So since the 90s, we had to design crypto engines and various mechanisms in order to ensure the communication, the processing, and the data storage on the mobile devices, including the IoT. So most of what's happening right now is very familiar for folks who have worked in telecommunication, but back then was very specific to the telecommunication industry, obviously. And starting 2000 with the internet, with the proliferation of internet, things have changed a little bit. So today's presentation, it's hopefully it's going to give you a little bit of insight of what's happening in the cybersecurity industry, more specifically, what are the trends within the industry market and the regulatory environment that have direct implication into the job opportunities. And this message is not only for professionals who are trying to upskill or reskill or have new career paths, but also for employers. If any one of you among here are employers, it is important to pay attention of some of these things, because if you're developing a product or a solution in Armenia and selling it outside, or if you're actually getting orders in order to develop any pieces of software, you will be subject to some of the implications that are coming. So the software bill of material mentioned earlier by Tapio, the secure supply chain risk management. If you're part of the supply chain, regardless if you're building a piece of the code or the entire code, you will be subject as an organization or as an individual in order to get there. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to actually make that upskilling and reskilling of our own employees, if you're an employer or if you're a career in this domain, actually to work in that direction. Hopefully, at the end of my presentation, you're going to be convinced. Again, here, cybersecurity has obviously, it has become an integral part of the digitization, right? So we speak a lot about the threats that are happening around the world. Most of the cybersecurity is driven, the threats are driven by the digitization and all the digitization strategy. Today, digitization and cybersecurity are synonymous. You can no longer, since World Bank is sponsoring this event, I'll shout out because there are good sessions on the World Bank that are actually already stating that digitization without cybersecurity, it's a high risk. So some of the advancements in economic or social development in various countries it's actually being slowed down because of the risk in cybersecurity that digitization involves. Transformation obviously this digital transformation keeps expanding not only the perimeter of security, but also the attack surface is expanding. You'll see a plethora of threats happening. If any of you had the opportunity, I would strongly recommend to tune in to the Cyber UK, which happened a couple of days ago. It's by the National Cybersecurity Center of the UK, which is literally the agency, the cybersecurity agency. It was a conference happened in London, but it's all online. It's on YouTube. If you need, we can send you the links. But fundamentally, it shows how those trends initially, cybersecurity was invented initially to protect DRM, digital right management, but as it evolves, became not only for an IP protection, into cybercrime, and now into critical infrastructure attacks, as most of the examples in those videos. I'm going to spare you those examples because they're telling a much better story than I will. And obviously, there's a whole bunch of reports here that are generated on why cybersecurity is no longer optional. It's actually mandatory, and you can no longer move to any digitization without cybersecurity in mind. About a year ago, almost 6 months ago, we were at the ARMSEC, and Stefan Saturian said very, very nicely in terms of cybersecurity, it's mindset. It's literally a change the way you code, you develop, you architect solution. It requires drive. It requires somebody having a drive and a motivation, but it's also a lot about discipline and diligence. More than technology, discipline and diligence. And if Tapio's example this morning, if you see any of that, 80% of it is not necessarily technology. It's you have to understand technology, but apply discipline and diligence in order to have the asset management. If you don't do the proper asset management, no technology can solve you, no technology can help you. So diligence and discipline are critical. This is the US cybersecurity strategy, and which was released last March. I want to bring to your attention, there are two types of cybersecurity conversations happening. One is what you're more familiar with, it's the ISO 27001, which is intended to protect the network. ISO 20001, it's intended to protect enterprise or government or other assets in the absence of knowing what is connecting to the system, right? Because you can always authenticate, you can always verify and put credentials, but you don't know what the software bill of material on the device is. It's such a big threat right now that the governments have realized that you can no longer protect the network. No enterprise, no government can protect their assets without actually identifying, authenticating, and understanding what's on the device that is trying to connect, that endpoint. And that endpoint could be an IoT device, a smartphone, or a server. It doesn't matter. I think understanding the exact nature of the software components and the bill of material of the device, it's important. Part of what you will hear a lot of the software bill of material, supply chain risk management, and zero trust network architecture, they all depend on you understanding what's at the endpoint that is trying to connect your network. As a result, most of the strategic objectives are actually intended to do two things. First of all, intended to actually be more stringent on the requirements on how these devices are being built. And secondly, transferring the responsibility from the enterprises who are buying these gadgets to actually the ones who are manufacturing them, importing them, and selling them. That's a major shift in philosophy in North America and Western, because that means if you're in a developer world, you can no longer just build it, throw it across the fence. And you'll see a little bit later on what comes in. Obviously, the US is putting all of their weight behind this by incentivizing, and the federal government by not purchasing anything that is not compliant to their requirements. This is not just a US thing, this is just a picture of all of the regulatory developments going on, which are very, very specifically not ISO 27000, these are very specifically to secure by design approaches and philosophies, but they are actually now being regulated and mandated. A couple of them here, I'm going to go very quickly through this. This is the US version. A couple of areas I'm going to highlight where it's really you have to pay attention is most of these themes are common regardless which country we look at, because all of these requirements are being tightly coordinated, and hopefully you will see at the end. So be it firmware over-the-air update or secure firmware update, identity, cryptography, that has to be native to the design. That was in the US. This is in the UK. A legislation passed a year and a half ago. It came into force as of the 29th of April 2024, which requires that no devices can no longer be sold in UK, regardless if they're manufactured in UK or elsewhere. They can no longer be sold in UK if they do not have these three mandatory requirements. These are just the starting points of a set of 13 that they're going to come, which are as part of an ETSI standard 303.645, and I will mention a little bit later on. Actually, it's mentioned right there. Again, attention to vulnerability and how that impacts any developer in the room. This is the PSTI, just at the high level. Vulnerability disclosure policy is critical. Yes, it is a lot of process related, but for a company, an organization, if you're a company developing software for let's say, a European or a US customer, you have to be aware if they're subject to that regulation, those requirements are going to trickle down to you guys. So if you're developing a library or if you're developing an SDK or any piece of software, if they're going to be subject to it, you're going to be subject to those requirements. Why? Because if there is a vulnerability reporting, they're going to require it's going to be reported to them wherever they are, let's say Italy. they are going to come down and ask you in order to be able to troubleshoot and report and provide SLA. SLA is a service level agreement, which means there are some of the regulations are requiring 24-hour return time, at least acknowledging that you have received. Again, discipline, diligence, drive, right? This is the European version, the CRA, which is much broader, and it comes into effect in 2026. It is relevant to any connected device, any digital device, digital product. And again, you'll see what I've circled there. It's actually similar to all of the requirements that there are in the UK requirements. It's important to read at the bottom, basically, the digital element definition, it's any product that is connected. So it's not just IoT, in other words, right? I'm going to skip this one, just high level in terms of where the CRA is the Cybersecurity Resiliency Act. Again, this is the European regulation that it's right now is referring to one of the standards I mentioned there earlier, the ETSI, but there is a standard harmonization, which means you can use more than just one standard, right? European timelines here in terms of when it's coming into force. It's coming into force in 2024. The first set of requirements in 2027. Believe me, it looks very far. 3 years is not long enough for actually getting a lot of your products upgraded, or for you to upskill to get ready for that. Key issue here in terms of why these companies are going to force anybody in the supply chain, including us here, if we're doing any development, it's because there's a hefty penalties, as you can see, if they do not comply. Again, this is the SLA part in terms of if there is an incident, the companies are responsible within 24 hours to respond and then have a follow-up in 72 hours and have a recurring follow-up. This is not just for this regulation. There's a lot of industries actually forcing these requirements. Extending to the secure by design. So how you can mitigate this is literally making sure that your product and the software are secure by design. Secure by design means many things to many people, and as a result, a lot of the government have this group of government of 17 agencies, cybersecurity agencies, came up with guidelines and what it means, and they provide references, and they're strongly recommending also to make sure that organizations get ready for these requirements because they're partly mandated through regulation, partly recommended in order for the organizations to adopt them. And these guidelines are not only for the design, so they work on both ends. So they provide guidelines for the OEMs to build the product, but also guidelines to the purchasers, which are the enterprises or the governments, on what to ask. So they're literally putting pressure on all directions, from mandatory requirements, from the OEM supply chain, and also from the purchaser. So if you're in the middle trying to build a software for an OEM or for a customer, you will be subject to these regulations. This is another one, obviously, more specifically to the vendor. As you can see, as I mentioned, this is a little more advanced, the 5 Eyes that you're familiar with, that they have partnering. They're actually developing pieces of these requirements and regulations from distributed, i.e. because of resource constraints, every organization is doing a piece of it, but they're all coordinated. And you see the dates here, this is all very, very recent, right? I mean, as of last week, it was last week, there was also a pledge. There were 70 companies who pledged to comply to these goals, which is, again, vulnerability disclosure, making sure there's no password, making sure the software are being updated, making sure they're not introducing any product with the bugs. And if there are bugs, they comply to the SLA, the service level agreements, in order to both report to the agencies as well as to fix them. Just a high level where ETSI is, I mean, you hear there's a lot of standards, a lot of specifications. It literally boils down to this list of 10 or 11 requirements that you'll see. It is secure configuration, secure, basically, communication or transport, secure processing and storage, and obviously making sure that there's malware on those devices. So what does this mean? What all this means for us? You could be working in the design stage, which is on the left side. You can be on the initial onboarding or provisioning stage, which is in the middle, or just the lifecycle management. In other words, your work will no longer stop when you deliver the product. You're actually on the hook for 5 to 10 years in supporting those products. And when I say products, includes any piece of code that you supply to any of your customers. You're an independent developer or you're a corporation, you'll be subject to those requirements. So getting ready, understanding what those requirements are, getting ready, getting organized, getting a little more discipline in the code development. Most of you are already familiar with the SWMBOK, the SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle Management, that those are practices, but those practices now are coming with a set of requirements through the industry. You see a lot of these words in terms of secure by default, secure by design. Secure by design, it means you literally start designing it without necessarily letting any piece of software be left open or any piece of software be there for no reason or for just a partly reason. So that fundamentally you design everything secure for a purpose and everything verified at every stages. So when you hear about secure boot, chain of boot, root of trust, certificates, etc., all of those concepts are going to be necessary for applying any of these control mechanisms, either at the design stage, at onboarding stage, or post-lifecycle management, post-launch lifecycle management. We can boil down, so what are we doing? Why is all this? How can you get some of these requirements? Last year, so BSides has been in Armenia for the last 3-4 years. We developed a training program as we were working on the software. And as of last year, we did our first IoT Secure by Design bootcamp with the Instigate Training Center. And this year, we're planning to continue with this year for the second part of it, which will be announced shortly. But if you boil it down, and what we try to achieve right now is literally the components that are required to comply to the requirements we just mentioned are listed here. So we need to have a root of trust, you need to have a secure boot mechanism, secure communication, obviously a secure cryptographic services for all of your cryptographic functions. Endpoint identity, it has to be unique, it has to be tamper-proof. And lastly, obviously, the endpoint configuration management, which is related to both software updates as well as configuration management. The top part is more advanced in terms of doing threat management or any analytic. So those are, the blue ones are what we're going to cover in the IoT Secure by Design training program this summer. Through that process, we actually, and Humbertsum is going to follow me with more details on this one, but we're going to look into the IoT devices, dev kits that we will have firmware, software, and hardware that we will have to be configured. The intention is to have a root of trust and chain of trust that goes all the way from the device ID level and a root certificate level, to have a multi-stage bootloader and secure any application goes in there. So earlier when we were talking about software bill of material, if any piece of the software is not validated on the device before connecting, then you cannot trust that device the same way as you would have if every single one of them have been designed and signed for. In other words, if you want to apply zero trust architecture means, anybody? The slogan for zero trust architecture, never trust, always verify, right? That's the slogan. Well, for verification, you need information about the endpoint, and for that endpoint information to be trustworthy, you need to validate the integrity. Hence, you need all of these pieces on the device, when that information is being reported. So starting up the device is the first piece. Provisioning, if you remember the provisioning and the onboarding or configuration part, we also look into a trusted network onboarding. We follow, through the training mechanism, we follow NIST requirements for trusted network onboarding. NIST, obviously you're familiar with the NIST standards. We go to the NCCOE. We use the onboarding standards from Intel and ARM, the FIDO. And we look into generating all of the keys pre-shared onto the devices and the those keys never leave the device, hence minimize the exposure. Again, the IANA, the DNS, which is a part of one of the modular, I'm just going to go quickly, and Hambartsum is going to cover in detail. As I said, it's not just developing it, configuring and installing it, but then there is a lifecycle management for an ongoing authorization and authentication, which is part of the Zero Trust Network architecture, for service activation, or for lifecycle management, so both FODA or end-of-lifing. And this concludes my presentation. The more detail Hambartsum is going to cover on the technical side of it in the next presentation. So I'm going to stop here, and if you have any questions, I'll gladly answer them in Armenian, if I can. Շնորհակալ